Welcome into Priced Out, the podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Morgan, in studio today with Cornelius Swart. How you doing today, boss?
I'm good, man. How was your trip?
It was pretty good, man. My daughter graduated, and that's always the graduation music I just knew would break me down, but it didn't. None of us cried.
You didn't cry.
We didn't cry. Of course, we broke the rule that every family breaks. They say don't cheer for your kid. Yeah, we yelled.
You got it. You got it.
It almost broke off into a chant.
People love that, though. People love it. Everybody
yes,
in the audience, you always like to hear the people who break the rule and chant. And
I couldn't imagine being at a graduation and not breaking the rule. So today we've got a really, really great show for them, and it's we're going to talk about St. Louis and gentrification in St. Louis.
Yeah, St. Louis, and there is no gentrification in St. Louis, or at least that is the line that most people will hand you if you talk about the issue there. But there's a lot going on. It's got a very it's a really cool city. I really, really like St. Louis. I keep saying it.
You're gonna live there, aren't you?
I'm thinking about it. Portland's getting kind of expensive and stuffy. And yeah, St. Louis really is kind of like where Portland was in the 90s. And it's got a lot of problems, a lot of problems, but a lot of promise and opportunity. And we're talking to two really, really smart young people here. So we can just jump right into it.
Yeah, let's get it going.
Hi, folks. I'm really happy to be here with two St. Louis residents, Rebeca Carlos and Kevin Hopkins. I really love St. Louis. I was just there during the St. Louis International Film Festival. I fell in love with the city. It's a cool city. There's a lot going on. I knew nothing about the city, and it's just a huge, vibrant area with a lot of cool people, and as we're going to talk about, obviously a lot of big problems too. But it's sort of being discovered right now, so it's a great time to have this conversation.
Absolutely.
Of course, 100%.
So Rebecca is known as Bex, and she's a freelance audio editor and co-host of the podcast Explain to Me, which is available on iTunes and Google Play. Kevin is a native of East St. Louis, Illinois, and has worked for 25 years on both nonprofit and for-profit organizations. For the past 3 years, he's worked to develop educational and vocational programming for at-risk communities. His passion is for photography, and that has taken him to many communities within the region and allowed him to see a lot of the changes that have been happening, both good and bad. So, guys, when I went to St. Louis, with Priced Out, the most common thing I heard was there is no gentrification in St. Louis. So what do you guys think?
I can definitely see gentrification happening. I graduated from college in 1991 and came back to the St. Louis area immediately afterwards. The area at the time was, partially developed. When you look at the television commercials about St. Louis, they'd always show the skyline, but that was just a small section of the downtown area. On the ground level, there were a few scattered businesses, but nowhere near the type of development that you see now. But between 91 and now, St. Louis basically plummeted in terms of businesses located downtown, people located downtown, and generally after 5:30, 6 o'clock, the St. Louis downtown area was a ghost town. There was nothing there. If you walked the streets, you had the city to yourself.
Yeah, that's so typical of so many, mid-sized cities during the 90s and even the last 10 years. And now so many places are roaring back, every place, and starting with downtown. And Rebecca, was that your experience too?
Yeah, so I actually remember, I grew up in the 90s. I remember going downtown just to be able to go to Union Station and some of the surrounding areas. Union Station used to be very hoppin'. There were so many businesses, and I probably in 2014 started working for MS Communication at the time, and they shared a parking lot with Union Station, and it was a ghost town. Some of the VJs that were there had told me that they had went in for the Starbucks for a really long time, and then once that kind of closed, there was no reason to really go in there anymore. So when I worked there, I think there was the Fudgery, which I don't remember the actual name of it, but that
the Fudgery,
fudge, and there was a couple of other. The Fudgery, it was a Fudgery. They sold fudge,
Right.
Like But that was a big staple at Union Station. They would cheer and they would sing and they would give you fudge. And so, I have a lot of memories of that specific shop. And so it was so strange, when I worked at Emmis, which was right there, that it was one of the only staples that were left. The movie theater had since closed. There's really, truly nothing there.
And now St. Louis as a ghost town, we see that all over the country. And like the rest of the country, there's a reason for it. And that has to do with the history of discrimination, housing discrimination, and white flight. And St. Louis's story is particular. It's very unique. Do you guys why don't we jump into a little bit of the history of St. Louis?
There's a couple of different factors that I think go into the history and why St. Louis is set up the way that it is. The Delmar Divide comes to mind.
That was 1916.
So we can start with that, but then 1916, correct. So there was an ordinance that was passed. It was a Jim Crow era law that basically said that if 75% of the residents in a specific area were of a certain race, another member of a different race could not move in there. So that existed for about 32 years until the NAACP went to court and they deemed it unconstitutional. However, for those 32 years, the law was in effect. So it had already kind of set them up for the segregation that continues to this day. Predominantly during that time, the Ville was the main African-American neighborhood. And that is just slightly north of the Delmar Divide. South is where you see a lot of successful shops and boutiques and restaurants. And I'm sure Kevin, can talk a little bit too about his experience with the Delmar Divide. It's very apparent.
It truly is. There are sections that you can literally stand on one side of the street and be in an area that is below the poverty level, and directly across the street, you'll see the types of shops and boutiques that Becky was just talking about. It is that stark of a difference.
What neighborhoods would those be? Where would you see that?
It's typically classified as University City, although, that Delmar Divide is really where it permeates. So once you are on Delmar and you cross Skinker Boulevard, it used to be, that's when you see that huge difference. Now that there has been a little bit of development in the University City area, you can kind of see some shops and businesses creep up across that Skinker line, but it is in no way reflective of the larger grouping of businesses and services that are in University City.
So that's old school Jim Crow law that's still, the legacy is still playing out in the city today with sharp racial and class divisions in the city.
Oh, most definitely, because the Delmar Loop, which is just slightly south, well, I guess it's the divider, but that, you see a lot of up-and-coming shops and stuff. It is kind of in the center of where St. Louis University and Washington University are, which is sort of kind of the midtown area. So you see a lot of revitalization there because they're students and, they come in, and there have been a lot more of off-campus housing built. So it's, it is good because it is helping some money to come in, but you can definitely see the changes in the Delmar Loop that have been done, in the last 10 years, definitely, but even just in the last five, there's a big push to build a trolley, which I think would be a cute idea, but $51 million have already gone into the project, and it just kind of keeps getting pushed off.
And so that's kind of getting into today's sort of new Delmar gentrified environment, but going back to Jim Crow, essentially that divide meant that, would you say, like, everybody on one side was poor and black and everybody on the other side of the Delmar was richer and white?
I would say kind of that's the case, especially because there was an area called Mill Creek Valley, which they started renovation on that in 1959, and most of the people who lived there were displaced over to what was the Ville. So it was sort of the dividing, like, this is where these types of people live and this is where these types of people live.
Was there the Great Migration that happened in St. Louis, where there was a lot of African Americans that moved into the city at one particular time?
Absolutely. That was pre 1917, and in that area of time, probably the biggest event of that era that is most racially charged is what's classified as a race riot in 1917, and that was essentially due to the northern migration of blacks that were in the southern part of the United States. At one point, East St. Louis was one of the largest cities in the United States, and there were a lot of job openings through textile mills and livestock processing factories. And so a lot of the blacks moved to the area to get jobs, largely in part because of some of the strikes that were happening with the white workers. Now, with this great migration, there became hot spots, and a lot of racial tension developed between the blacks that were moving north to get these jobs and the white strikers. And in 1917, a few incidents evolved that actually created this riot condition in which several blacks were killed. Now, the actual number is still disputed. Some say as few as maybe 10 or 15, but the number also goes up as high as maybe 250. So we'll never really know how many, but there were definite murders on the street. Property was burned, and that whole era, that time period, caused many of the blacks in East St. Louis to migrate to St. Louis and basically continue going further north where they could avoid, so they thought, a lot of the racial tension that had begun to creep up in the city, in the area.
And so the area kind of got a bad reputation for race relations, I imagine.
It absolutely did. That set off a chain of events, which, a lot of people say started the freedom movements that would soon follow, which led to a lot of the white flight from the East St. Louis area. And, the business closings could be for different reasons, maybe just because industry had played its part and had begun to fall away to technology. But the East St. Louis of today is definitely a victim of that time period, because at one point you had about 82,000 residents in this area. Today you've got fewer than 30,000 residents. So you have a significant drop in population. You've got a median income of around $19,000, which is about $30,000 less than the median income in other parts of the state of Illinois. So you have an extreme level of poverty with large masses of land that are undeveloped and basically being left to fall apart due to the loss of business, the migration of the population that was here when I was growing up. And so what you have in East St. Louis is a place that is prime for development. However, no development is happening, or little development, I would say. So little that it's almost unnoticeable.
And there's a big minority population in East St. Louis.
It's probably 98% African American.
And so people understand who are listening to this, East St. Louis is just across the river from downtown St. Louis, but it's also in a different state. It's in Illinois. So, sometimes you get this situation like Philadelphia is across the river from Camden, New Jersey. New Jersey is where I'm from, and so that's a very, very poor place, and cities can sometimes kind of export people and problems to these other cities that are in other states, and it becomes very difficult for an economic relationship to reestablish itself between these two communities. We've seen this in other places. And I want to get back to East St. Louis, but I wanted to also talk about North St. Louis. And I want to get back to East St. Louis, but I wanted to also talk about North St. Louis, which is between downtown and Ferguson, And I was just in St. Louis for a couple of days last year and drove around to Old North St. Louis. And it was amazing the amount of that there were no buildings in the area. It was like a prairie that there were, the place looked like it had been leveled. What happened to North St. Louis?
Well, a lot of North St. Louis fell victim to the same, I guess you would say, plague of white flight and business closing due to, the relocation of textile industries, that types of thing. But it was also primarily a largely African-American population. And so when the downtown area, the immediate downtown St. Louis area, was left to crumble, you began to have a loss of income for the blacks that lived in that area. So, of course, they had to move to different areas of the city to find work. A lot of those people moved to North St. Louis County or South St. Louis. And so that's where you see those large populations of African Americans being set up now. Come to replace those people have been some smaller businesses. Some have maintained, but now you see some developments of some of the boutiques. And a little bit of the gentrification that we spoke of earlier has begun to show its head. So that displacement of the people that were there, and now they're being replaced with these retail shops and boutiques and galleries in some respect. It's great for the look of St. Louis, but it is bad for the feel of St. Louis in terms of race relations.
And it seems like the city pursued urban renewal policies, what they used to call slum clearance, that really pushed people, created ghettos, but also like wiped out neighborhoods. And so there was white flight, but there was also kind of black displacement into the suburbs.
Oh, yeah. I think we had sort of talked about this before a little bit with Spanish Lake, and that sort of being the beginning of white flight, especially that I experienced because I grew up in Florissant, which is in North St. Louis County. So, yeah, I remember, so I was like a child in the 90s, and a lot of my friends were moving away. And at the time, I didn't think of all these things that went along with it. But there's actually this tactic that's very commonly used by real estate agents, which I was not familiar with, called block busting. Were you guys familiar? Are you familiar with it?
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, yeah, where it's basically that they give the illusion or whatever that racial minorities are going to move into the area, that their houses are going to be worthless, that they need to sell now at a lower price, So definitely saw that in Florissant growing up. It kind of started in Spanish Lake and sort of moved out from there into, Florissant, Ferguson, some of the surrounding areas. And that was due, I believe, there was some Section 8 apartments in the downtown area, Wendell Pruitt Homes and William Igo Apartments. I think we were called Pruitt Igo. Yeah.
Pruitt Igo, yeah.
So those were demolished, and so I think that also led to a lot of the moving of people over to the county, which caused a lot of white flight. You see a lot of people who lived in Florissant, Ferguson, like I said, the surrounding areas, then moving to St. Charles, right across the bridge, Chesterfield, St. Peter's, O'Fallon, Wentzville, getting further and further away from the city.
And there's a great documentary called The Pruitt-Igoe Myth, which is about the creation and then destruction of the Pruitt-Igoe public housing project.
Yeah.
Right.
And it does a great job of explaining how, as we try to explain in our film, how, the suburbs, the white suburbs, were segregated and subsidized by the government, and the inner city was sort of regulated to be poor. It was not a creation of the free market by any stretch of the imagination. The government set it up so that people were contained and deprived of investment in the inner city, and whites were given assistance in moving to the suburbs, and they do a great job in that. And there's also a Spanish Lakes documentary about white flight. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Which came out just a couple of years ago. It came out like maybe just a few months before the Ferguson uprising.
Right, and I hadn't seen that that documentary about Spanish Lake until after the this disharmony in Ferguson. But after I saw it, it kind of helped put a lot of things into place in my mind, you know, in terms of how the region was feeling, how the people within the region were feeling about one another. Now, I'll tell you, growing up in East St. Louis, and for me, this was between the 60s and 80s, I would say. At the time, East St. Louis had to be 99.9% black. And so the prejudices that people experience now in St. Louis being a racially integrated city, I didn't experience those prejudices. So I had no idea that people didn't like being next to one another. It was totally foreign to me. So, you know, coming up in the eras after being away at college really was an eye-opening experience, and I began to see the region and the country in a completely different way, unfortunately.
You say, you know, there's more integration in St. Louis now, and maybe some of that's coming in because of the gentrification. But, you know, the interview I saw that will be we'll have a link to the interview about the Spanish Lakes documentary in the show notes. But in that interview, they said that this movie was actually banned from movie theaters because it was so close to Ferguson that movie theaters were afraid that it would create riots just to play this film. Do you feel that East St. Louis has anywhere near that level of tension and resentment building up?
Oh, no. East St. Louis is eager for a resurgence. I can tell you that now. You can drive around the city and you can talk to people, and people are ready for the city to rebuild itself, if not on its own, with outside help. And, you know, as I said now, there are other racial groups that live in the city and on the outskirts of the city, and you definitely don't feel that kind of tension that you feel in certain areas of St. Louis City and County. So there's much more cohesion, maybe because we're all in the same economic class as far as the city is concerned. You know, East St. Louis and the surrounding areas, the immediate surrounding areas, are considered poor. So maybe that's one of the things that brings us together. So we don't necessarily feel that sense of competition, and maybe that's the thing that helps us.
Now, tell us more. Let's talk about East St. Louis. What do you think the problems stem from? You know, we talked about this, you know, very shallow news report that this reporter kind of went in, a TV reporter, and did a quick look around the town because a viewer had asked him why there was no economic revitalization going on there. And, you know, to the reporter's credit, I mean, I was a reporter. I know that you just don't have enough time sometimes to do stories. And he had said, well, you know, there's not a lot of development, but there's a casino here on the river, and that produces a lot of money. But where is that money gone? And then he said, well, the mayor gets paid, you know, $40,000 a year, and it's a symbolic office, and the city manager makes $100,000 a year, and what's he doing? So he kind of laid it at the feet of the politicians. Is that what you see going on? What do you think is going on?
I do. I think the problem in East St. Louis is multifaceted. I do think that the white flight initially played a large part in the current lack of development. What I see happening now, in my opinion, is that as families have moved out, you know, there's been the brain drain because a lot of students have left to pursue higher education, and then they don't come back because there are no jobs to come back to. So you have that continuous displacement of a pool of tax-paying, community-supporting folk. Now, when you couple that with a lot of the political controversies that have happened in the region, the fact that East St. Louis has typically become a vice dumping ground for surrounding areas, and the continuous negative publicity that the city gets, it's no wonder that investors don't want to come back. Now, you can say maybe it's just the investors, maybe it's the bad reputation, but if you ask around, you'll find that, there's probably been a lot of property that's been bought up and held onto in hopes of the community totally collapsing, and then developers coming in and offering premium prices on this land that's being held. Now, can I point the finger to anyone specifically? No, I would not dare. I haven't done the research on that. But I think that anyone doing any digging would find that a lot of this property that has been left undeveloped, and they look at the history of areas like this, they'll see that it's not because it can't be developed, it's because it's being held on to for premium prices.
Yeah, and that's obviously we're speculating, but that was my question when looking at this reporter's work was, well, who? And he would drive around downtown, which is just all boarded up. It's very sad to see. But my question was like, well, who owns all that property? People own property for profit, even when it's in an area where it seems like there's no economic activity and it's depressed. People are still making money off their properties. Either as tax write-offs or because, even if it's a low-income building, people make vast profits on that stuff. So, and we had talked about there was precedent for that in Detroit, where when we had our earlier conversation in a previous podcast about the last days of Chinatown, there were billionaires who were scooping up properties left and right in Detroit, waiting for it to go into bankruptcy. And hiding their ownership under dozens and dozens of shell corporations so that people didn't know that a billionaire owned all the property, so that they would drive prices down and basically trying to drive the city into a crisis, or trying to keep it at least economically depressed so that they could continue to make their backroom play. And so we do know that goes on, and it's very troubling.
So, the area that is generally identified as downtown East St. Louis is definitely mostly abandoned. When I was growing up, you had about a 6 or 7 square block area that was retail business and service providers. And now that's been greatly reduced. You could probably fit all the open businesses into maybe a 2-block area. And so that's a huge problem. And again, that's right across the river. So when you drive into East St. Louis from St. Louis and see that, you think, wow, this city is on the downslide. But as you go a little bit further out, you see homes and apartments that are being developed. You see a business district. You see new schools that have been built to replace the schools that have been broken down. So there is a spirit of revitalization, but it is being greatly overshadowed by this blight and by this, desire to basically break the city down and come back for personal profit.
Now, Rebecca, that is, there is revitalization going on in St. Louis, like you were saying earlier, Delmar Loop. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the neighborhoods that are coming back, whether they're perceived as gentrifying or not?
Sure. I live in Midtown, so the Grove, I can see a lot of up and coming growth. They're building like luxury apartments, so there's going to be a lot of more opportunity to live in the Grove. You also see it in the Central West End. There's a lot more revitalization. When they brought in the IKEA, there's an organization called Cortex, which is sort of the middleman between Washington University and St. Louis University. And in order to build anything in that area, it has to go through core tax. So when they built the IKEA, they had to buy out 11 lot owners, I believe. So it's great because they're bringing in new businesses and whatnot. Another one, South Grand, is a lot more trendy, Tower Grove area. You see it, this big influx of 20 and 30 somethings because you can buy a affordable house in St. Louis. It's great. I will say it's great, but sometimes I just worry that this influx of people, also another revitalization project that's coming up in Midtown, there's the Foundry, the City Foundry or something like that that's going to be built. It's kind of similar to the idea of Ballpark Village, which is located in the downtown St. Louis area. So lots of shops, apartments, restaurants, things like that. It's great. However, it makes it really difficult for the people who already live in the St. Louis area to live there because the rent's going to skyrocket. So, you know, it's wonderful that all these things are moving to St. Louis. However, I just worry about people like myself who already live down here. We've gotten accustomed to living in this area and how much it's going to impact us, and it's going to be difficult to live in our hometown. And it's heartbreaking.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we were just talking before we started that, you know, it's kind of an exciting city to be in right now because there are so many cool people there and it is affordable. There's also historic areas that are kind of starting to be refurbished. We talked a lot about Benton Park, where it's still like very funky and, you know, bohemian and very mixed racially and a lot of young people. But yeah, that's always like the opening act. And then things get really, really pricey after that.
Yeah.
What is the general attitude of people here in St. Louis, though? Do they see these changes still as good, or is there more concern, or you know, in leadership? Are people looking down the road and saying, "Well, this is great, but we also have to plan for our downside"?
I mean, I think a lot of the people who live here see both sides of it. Like, for example, I had mentioned the trolley in the Delmar Loop earlier. That's been a big project that they've been working on since 2010, which, you know, there's some really great aspects to the project. You know, it'd be amazing to get around downtown. I think it would be very cool if eventually there's a trolley leading from the downtown to, you know, the Central West End, Midtown, and the Delmar Loop. It all interconnects. That would be great. But we're a very long time from that, especially since the one in the Delmar Loop, the construction budget was $51 million, and it just keeps getting pushed off. It keeps getting pushed off. But I'm already thinking, wow, this is already an inconvenience to me to get to work. You know, so it makes me think that these changes are not for people like me who already live down here. It's to bring in people who don't live here just to come and visit for like a day or two and then, you know, disappear, which, you know, maybe the city needs.
So it sounds like people are still kind of focused on, we need to get new investment in here, you know, one way or the other. And there's, like, for example, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, which sounds really ominous, but it's really just like a mapping agency, right? But it's got a huge facility that's going to be going in North St. Louis, in which there were some condemnations and some takings, some eminent domain where they took property away from people. But it sounds like people are still kind of just, not to say desperate, but so eager to get things fixed up and people back into the city that there's not a lot of long-term vision about the downsides.
Right, but one of the problems with that, you know, is that the people, as Rebecca mentioned, that live here now won't be able to afford it. And when you bring in a lot of the types of jobs that are being considered, the people that are here in the area may not necessarily be qualified to get those jobs. So while it's a great revenue source for the city and, you know, low property values for the business owners, what true benefit is there for the actual residents? You know, how's it going to help their income, their standard of living? You know, that's still totally in the air.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You hit the nail on the head, is that, yeah, these schemes often just bring in new people with bigger salaries and more job skills, or the right kind of skills. and it completely passes the local people by, but it's sold to locals as this is going to create jobs, this is going to create improvements, this will trickle down to you. But it never does. I mean, I've been looking at this for years, and it doesn't happen. So, man, what do you think St. Louis and St. Louis? What should citizens be doing? What should the government officials be doing?
I don't think the government officials really know what to do. I think that to a large degree for them, it's just about securing another term in office. Creating another sound bite that sounds good to help their party get elected or serve whatever, purpose they have truly sought office for. I've become completely skeptical about anyone's will to further the advancement of the people in their region, simply because, like you, I've seen this happen for so long in cities that have such great resources and so little overall advancement.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It just seems like people are just kind of wondering what's going to help line their pockets at the end of the day.
Well, man, is there any good news? Is there anything that people should, and some bright spots people should focus on?
Well, in my view, I think that there is a lot of job training that's being offered now. A lot in technology, a lot of opportunities for entrepreneurs. It's just that a lot of those things aren't really highly publicized, at least not in the way that they should be for the local population to take advantage of it. It's great for business, it's great for the brochures, but in terms of the long-term effect and improvement on the communities, there needs to be a greater push on those available services and opportunities for the city to truly grow and benefit from their presence.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Kevin and I actually met as part of AmeriCorps. We both worked at two different organizations, and that was sort of an effort after all of the events with Ferguson to sort of help provide more opportunities within the area. And I mean, I think we both have very different experience of what, we saw. And I feel like on my end, I did see some change, but it's just so little in the grand scheme of things. And, I would love to have the answers on how to make the city better and how to provide more opportunities for the residents of the St. Louis area, but I truly just don't know. But I think there's always that optimist in me that hopes for the change. So, that's possibly something that could come out of some of the sources that are coming into the area.
Maybe the approach ought to be in the same way that you would eat an elephant, one bite at a time. We look at the problem maybe from too high a view, 30,000 feet, when we need to get on the ground level and address these issues block by block. And the next thing you know, we might have a truly great city.
I think you got it there, Kevin. I think you do.
I think so too. I just wish that, because something I see as a big problem in the city of St. Louis is people don't see other parts of the city just beyond their backyard. People in Ladue care about Ladue. People in downtown St. Louis care about people in downtown St. Louis. It needs to become unified again, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
Well, I am optimistic because St. Louis has very cool, smart folks like you, young folks, thinking about this stuff. And, you guys are looking at the big picture. So I think it's going to be, I think there's opportunities. I certainly hope there are. And, there's lots of policies. Yeah. And if you just, keep your eye on what other communities are doing, things like community benefits agreements, when big projects go in, that they have to actually have concrete plans on how they're going to help locals, not just a promise of jobs. Regulations that require developers to build affordable housing is when they do their free market housing. And, protection for renters and vulnerable residents. We're seeing, lots of new policies happening all around the country. And I think St. Louis is in a good position because they've got a little time and they can sit back and look at what other cities are doing right and try to throw those ideas into the mix locally.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, guys. Anything else? Do you want to plug anything else or point out anything else before we sign up?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to speak, and hopefully some really good ideas come out of this. Maybe this conversation will spark some development or some other ideas from listeners.
Yeah, I'm always up for things that could make the city better. So hopefully we helped provide a little bit of insight into a very complicated city.
Right on, guys. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that's St. Louis. I really do feel optimistic about that city as much as one can, can feel. But
let's start over.
there's a fly in the room.
I wasn't aware.
Andrew, it does not like flies. I had no idea you hated flies so much.
I just was focused in on the fly. Welcome back.
You guys can't see this, but
Yeah.
Andrew was freaking out on that fly.
I'll keep it in.
I have an electric fly swatter. Have you ever seen these things?
No.
It looks like a tennis racket, and you charge it, and you swing at the fly, and it just zaps them, just like a bug zapper.
Oh, like a lifesaver kind of.
Yeah, like a lightsaber, exactly.
Oh, wow.
Speaking of, we like to talk a little bit pop culture here.
Yes, we do. Typically.
Have you seen
Solo?
Solo?
No, I am actually going solo to it. I could not convince anyone in my family. They were like, okay, you're geeking out too much. They were with me with Marvel and DC, but they were like, no, we're not going to see that. So
I'll go see Solo with you if you're looking for a wingman.
There we go. That's what we're going to have to do.
I'll be your Chewbacca.
I don't know enough about that to know.
Oh, so you're kind of new to the Star Wars
Well,
thing.
I watched the first ones, the ones that came out when I was, like an infant or not born yet. And I like pointing out that, it's getting close to your birthday and you're 10 years older than me.
He's rubbing that in all the time.
But, I like those. And then the new ones came out, and I think Jar Jar Binks rubbed me the wrong way, and I stopped watching
everybody the wrong way. He was just...
It was weird.
It's an atrocity. It's a science fiction atrocity.
It could have just been a bad movie, but we all just dumped it all on, not the writers, just him. Yeah. Nonfiction.
So many problems.
Yeah. So...
Well, so I grew up with these films, and I saw the first one, Star Wars, like 9 times in the movie theater.
Really?
Yeah. I was obsessed with. I was 5 years old though.
Yeah.
And so I'm happy to see the Solo one, and I'm glad that they're bringing back Lando.
Yes.
And I think he looks. It looks like a cool character, and of course a huge celebrity. He's really the biggest star in the film, other than the Game of Thrones girl. They're probably the power players in that whole film.
And I feel like Donald Glover is perfect for it. It's just kind of like, hey, you don't get any cooler, because Billy D. Williams,
he's a smooth-looking dude. He's just a smooth dude.
And even when you go back to In All Truthfulness, Billy D. Williams really was the big star then.
Yeah, he was.
But I do understand who Harrison Ford is now, and but Billy D. was the man then.
He really had the biggest box office successes. Harrison Ford made Raiders of the Lost Ark between the first and second movie, so he became a big star.
Yeah.
But really, the Billy D. Williams had the name recognition going in.
Yeah. So I'm glad they brought it back. They even brought it back in the comics, and so I'm reading those right now, kind of getting through it, and it's basically the same thing. He's just a smooth talking character. He essentially is what Captain Kirk will like. It's kind of like, and I know Star Wars people cringe when you cross over, but it's like, it's that. Man, he's just gaming, alien women. So he's just
the Black Kirk. He's the Black Kirk.
yeah, sort of like that. Yes, there you go. There's so many people that are upset with us right now.
we need to stir a little controversy here.
We have to. So.
Well, I admire your spirit. You were really trying to get into being a Portlander by going full nerd on comics, and now
I'm trying to find my way into Portland. I'm gonna let them gentrify me just a little bit, Yeah. So.
Well, next week we have another good show. We have a really interesting conversation. We think that you'll enjoy, which is part of a new series that we're gonna call Things Cut Out, or just Cut Out. Things that were not priced out, that we should have covered, but we couldn't just because of time. And this is actually something that was left out of Northeast Passage, our first gentrification documentary. We have an interview with Rashawn Mohammed, who was at the time of the first documentary a drug dealer on that street in that area, and he is going to tell us about his experiences. He now works in community work, today, but he's going to talk about the drug wars, about what was going on the untold story. We saw in that first film how Nikki Williams was reacting to people on her block that she thought were drug dealers. And this is going to be the other side of the story, which we never even had the courage to try to tell.
Yeah.
You never even considered. I mean, my fault as a fledgling journalist that never even tried to talk to people on the other side of that issue, on the other side of the street. So I think it's going to be a really, really cool show.
All right. Looking forward to it, man. So see you next time on Priced Out.
Thanks, guys. Oh, and please subscribe
Yes.
on iTunes and on our YouTube channel.